Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of The Lion, the Way, and the War, where we talk about Jesus, his church, and the spiritual battle that surrounds us. My name is Craig Allison, and I'll be your host. I am very excited to introduce you all to today's guest, who's calling in from Memphis, Tennessee. Allow me to introduce Dr. Walter Harrington. Walter and I go back a few years when we met in Chattanooga, where he was a student at UTC working towards his Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry. While he was at UTC, he became one of our student leaders at the Christian Student Center. Walter went on to get his Ph.D. in biomedical science from the University of Arkansas for medical sciences and is currently doing postdoctoral fellowship at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, studying the influenza virus. I know that Walter has a passion not only for science, but also religion, especially where these two intersect. I'd also like to mention before I forget that in addition to Walter's busy schedule, he keeps a blog called 2818.com. Walter, thanks so much for joining us today. How are you?
Hey, Craig. So good to be here.
So let's start with the obvious question, get it out of the way first, given your career path and our current situation. First of all, just want to ask, how is your postdoctoral work going at St. Jude?
Yeah, that's a good question to start off with. I'll start with the pre-COVID-19 postdoctoral work. I will say that Memphis has been great. We've been loving it here. St. Jude is such a great place to be, as I'm sure most of the people listening will already have an idea of. But I'm loving the lab that I'm in. As you said, my lab studies influenza. So we're actually in the infectious disease department of St. Jude. Not many people know that St. Jude does other research besides just cancer. Cancer is the major focus, but St. Jude is about researching all catastrophic pediatric diseases. And you know, when kids get cancer, usually one of the highest die from cancer is not necessarily the cancer itself, but secondary infections that they get because of weakened immune systems. So we play a pretty well, in my biased opinion, we play a pretty vital role. But so everything was going great, and then the pandemic hit. So now our flu work has pretty much been shut down, but I'm still going in half a week and helping with some COVID screening and testing. So it's different than research, and I'm ready to get back to research, but I'm happy to do what I can to help.
So based on your research right now, what are your thoughts on the current viral pandemic?
Well, I have so many thoughts. I'm not sure how accurate all the thoughts are, but I think that pandemic has served a wake-up call for America. And so one of the biggest things that I think America is seeing right now is everybody is like, why? This is a new thing. It's the new normal, the new nothing like this has ever happened before. And the thing is, pandemics have happened before. It's just that in America, we've been very lucky, and none of them in recent history has really affected America too much. I mean, you really have to go back to 1918 before you get the last pandemic that really affected America, and that was the Spanish flu in 1918. Right. But other pandemics and even other coronavirus pandemics have really kind of rocked the world. I will say pandemic. I guess it was more of an epidemic. But this is not a novel thing. And if you look at Asian countries and how Asian countries have responded to the pandemic, you can see that they're more prepared because this has happened there before. So I think this is like a first taste for America. But it's good in the fact that we need to see that our preparation could be better. And I think that this will really propel preparation for the next pandemic inevitably breaks out. Which, the flu community thinks it'll probably be flu, but again, we're biased there. So,
yeah. And you mentioned, us being unprepared as far as an American society, it really forced for the first time in our lifetimes, the church and our leaders to make some really tough decisions as far as from a spiritual standpoint, deciding not to have church services, which I think at first it was kind of a mixture. Some were a little bit resistant to the change, and they held out for a while. And then I think with more members being more and more concerned, a lot of church leadership decided to just go ahead and close the doors of church and having that people getting together in large gathering formats. So now I think we're pretty much doing the home churches across the board. So, that being said, for the first time I think pretty much anybody alive today, I don't know, like you mentioned, going back to 1918 was the last real pandemic here in America anyway, that affect Americans to the extent that it's affecting us today. So if you could put yourself in the position of a church leader today, obviously I think you would make the decision to go ahead and shut churches down and do exactly what we're doing. But from a spiritual standpoint, moral obligation kind of thing, how have you coped with that decision?
Yeah. So when all this was first starting, I was actually talking with our elders. Our elders actually called a group of the medical professionals at the church that I go to, and just to kind of try to get our input and what we thought about it. And we all gave our opinions. And then at the close of the meeting, I'm like, I got to tell you, I do not envy your decision, because I know it's a really tough decision at the beginning, especially back then when we really didn't know much of anything. And you have to make decisions on such limited data, because if you wait till all the data comes in, you won't have time to make the decision. So I think it was a really tough decision. I think ultimately it was the right decision. Although we might not really know that until a year out, but I'm one to be, better safe than sorry, especially with the typical church population. And if you look at like death rates from the virus, it's, if you're over a certain age, you're in a much higher risk category. And a lot of our churches have, a lot of members that are in that risk category. And if you think about it, if the virus only kills like 3% of the people, like just a baseline 3% of the people infected, and you have 300 people in your church, that's 3 people that have died because you didn't shut your doors, or some, not necessarily, but
Yeah.
so I think that the decision was a hard decision, but ultimately it was the right decision. But your question is more about should we have done it? What's the moral obligation? What's the biblical stance behind it? I guess, right? That's what you're.
I mean, it's kind of touches on that. And I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with this, don't get me wrong, but the stance of, well, where's your faith? I mean, you're cutting off the assembly, and we read in Hebrews, you don't forsake the assembly. And so, there's some people that take that kind of that hardline stance of, this is a test of faith. And here we've capitulated to this I guess just surrendering, rolling over, and being like, yep, we just close our doors. And I mean, in a way, I understand the argument where some people might take that as a lack of faith. And so that's kind of what I was getting at. I wanted to get your viewpoints on that. And secondary to that, Walter, is the long-term impact on churches. Do you think that this is going to being closed? And I have no idea when we're going to get back. Doors open here in Chattanooga, where we're going to follow the city government's advice on that, and that could be later on in May. We just don't know yet. But long-term impact, now that members have been out of church for quite a while now.
Yeah, and I think that it actually could be a really good wake-up call to the church. And I've heard all the arguments on, well, maybe not all the arguments, but I've heard a lot of people on both sides. And I do understand, like, I'm not one to say that meeting together doesn't matter, because I think it matters vitally. And I think, my experience has really taught me that. But the question that I think this pandemic has helped the church ask is, who are you? Like, are you the type of like, do you define your Christianity by, well, I'm at the church building on Sundays and Wednesdays, and if this pandemic is really disrupting your Christianity, that might be a really good question to internally ask yourself. Like, does my servitude towards Christ just involve being at church for church services, right? And again, I'm not diminishing the importance of being at church and being with the church family. I think that's super important. Um, but I think this has given us the opportunity to actually be more intentional with our relationships. And if we aren't more intentional with our relationships, it might serve to uncover a deeper problem within us. I know here it's been really tough here, being away from all the people that we love so much, and we were used to being with them, multiple times a week in and outside of church service. But we've kind of adapted. Like, I've been on more Zoom calls than I didn't even know what Zoom was before this pandemic hit, to be honest. But now I've got this whole setup in my room. I've been able to Zoom into Bible studies with the church I was at with Little Rock and see people that I would not be able to see normally, have fellowship with those people. I think that it has hopefully has prompted an intentionality to reaching out to the people that you're closest to in the church and making sure people are all right, making sure people can get their groceries, because there's this sense of we're all in this together. And stuff like this can either have the power to kill your faith, or it can have the power to really enliven your faith. And I think that has a lot to do with where you were at before any of this happened, right? So this is just kind of shows where your heart was at. From a biblical standpoint, I don't think that there's, there that gets into some muddy waters of like, is there really a command, so to speak, to meet on Sunday morning in a specific place? Because like when you look at it, like in the Bible, the early Christians all met in houses because there were no church buildings. There were no, the public meeting place was the temple where all Jews met, especially like very early on. So maybe it kind of brings out what the early church really did and how we can kind of follow that model. And I get like, we're in a different culture, we're in a different society now. And like all that has to be taken into account. But from the standpoint of a legalistic, if you don't, walk into the church building at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, then, you're sinning. I don't think that that's an issue here. But I do think there's an issue with, we need to check our hearts. And I think that some of the fears and worries from the churches are, what about those members that were kind of like on the edge before all this happened? And then we shut down church services and that was all they were going to, and they're kind of going to, drift off. And I think that's a real issue, but the real issue is with those people's hearts. And we really need to get to the bottom, like treat the problem and not just the symptom.
Yeah, you mentioned, being intentional. One of the, I guess, takeaways from this, and maybe one of the positive benefits, is it kind of weeds out the people who were lackadaisical in their faith, because now it's an effort to stay connected to people and continue to maintain and even grow relationships during a time when you're quarantined and you don't have that contact with people. And, that may have been surface level before this all started. And now if it was surface level, it's obviously even worse now. So that piece about being intentional, I think, is really important. For those that are listening to this, I just want to reiterate something here that I think is really important. Jesus expects us to be intentional with our relationships. It's not something that we can just sit back on and, put on autopilot and think that we're doing the right thing there. It's effort. It takes work, like in a relationship, and especially with our brothers and sisters in Christ. And for those too that may be struggling and are on the fringes, like you mentioned, it's got some hard work involved in it. So yeah. I really appreciate your input, your thoughts on that. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. And just again, we're getting some interference here. We've got, I don't know if you're hearing it on your end, Parker. Walter. I've got some storms coming in here in Northwest Georgia. So just for the listeners, bear with us as we get through some of the little glitches and audio stuff coming through. So setting the stage here, you and I have had a lot of conversations about the work at the Christian Student Center. What we're doing while you were there, how it impacted your faith, what was waiting for you as far as your continued spiritual growth once you left the CSC. You and I have had some just incredible conversations about all of that. And I'd also like to point out that for most college graduates, I'm trying to think of the way to say this, their religious maturation in faith, basically, for the most part, for a lot of them, and I'm speaking college in general, not necessarily those coming out of the CSC, their faith kind of deteriorates after they leave college. But you're not part of that statistic, Walter. I know that. So all of that to say, your background going through the CSC, being part of that campus ministry, both from the student aspect and then becoming a student leader there. Where would you say you are today as far as your faith and having that background with the Christian Student Center, and what impact, if any, and I hope it has a lot, did the CSC Christian Student Center have on you?
Yeah, I know that this is probably a cliche thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Christian Student Center literally changed my life, and I'm not saying like I was this, I went from this terrible person to this great person or anything like that. But I went from a faith that was, it was there and it was very loud, but it wasn't very grounded in much of anything. It was grounded in what I was given and what I was expected to believe, and I thought I knew all the answers. And I learned so much being at the Christian Student Center. I think we started at the same time.
We did.
My first year as student director was your first year as the campus minister, and
yes.
So that was a fun journey. And my faith just it like went through the fire, right? But in a good way. It was like a refining fire, where when you live with Christians 24/7, that can't, iron sharpens iron, right? It will sharpen you. And I think that I found answer I know that I was looking for. I still think that the Christian Student Center is the closest thing to Acts 2 that I've ever found in this life. And I get it, we're all on campus, we all live there. That's not ultimately a realistic thing for adult life, I guess. But that speaks to the question. And I think I saw this when I was in college. I think I gave a devotional one night called the Christian Midlife Crisis. Because, we're sitting there, there's a bunch of college kids, and we're all going to Central, and you look out there and you see the church has a bunch of young people and a bunch of older people. And the middle-age group there were obviously a lot of middle-age group there, but it was not as strong as the young people and the old people. So I would look out and say, well, what does that mean? Like, when you graduate, do you just automatically lose your faith? Like, is there this time that you just have to drop your faith and before you come back to faith, like maybe after you have kids or when you are getting older and you're thinking about dying, and you're like, it's like, where are the role models, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with, the American pursuit of money and passion and career and, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
But also a lot of it has to do with, we don't have those intentional relationships, and we don't live right next to each other or right down the hallway from one another. And I think that's a big deal. And I was really worried once I got out of college that I was just done. Like that was my great experience, and then I'm not going to have that. And I don't remember this too well, but you can ask Caleb, and he will tell you from Skype calls I had with him after I got to Little Rock. I guess I was really lonely when I first moved to Little Rock, and I was like, I'm never going to have that community again. But I learned that that's just not true. And you can have that community, again, going back to that intentionality. You just have to be intentional about it. And the church that I started going to in Little Rock turned out to be one of the greatest places I've ever been, just like the Student Center. Obviously, there's a lot of differences there. And again, we weren't living right next to each other. But, about a year into it, or half a year into it, we had started a young people's Bible study on Tuesday nights. We were going to church on Wednesday nights. We brought in a new preacher, and he started a 6 a.m. Thursday morning men's Bible study. And like after a year, I was like, in Chattanooga, I was doing Devo on Tuesday nights, church on Wednesday, and small group on Thursday. And I'm doing that here too. It's a little different, but like literally Tuesday night Bible study, Wednesday church, and Thursday another like a men's Bible study. And it was just crazy to me to see that like you can really have that community. You just have to look for it, and you have to be like, it's not just going to happen. And if you're somewhere where that's not happening, then maybe you need to be the catalyst. Like you need to be the one to step up and say, hey, I want to do this. And I think the key thing I learned in Little Rock to make that happen is consistency. And that's something I learned from Jacob, the preacher at the church there I went to. When he started the men's Bible study on Thursday, he said, we're going to do this 6 a.m. every Thursday, rain or shine, except for on like Christmas week or Thanksgiving week or something. And he's like, no matter who shows up, I'm going to be here. And it was that consistency that really drove it. And that's what we did for Bible study. We had a Bible study at our house, and we're like, Tuesday night Bible study, that's where we're at. And some nights we had one person show up, and some nights we had 20 people show up. And it just kind of varied, but we did it, And so the family that I found in Little Rock was such a blessing. I love them so much. I met the elders there, are some of the greatest men I know to this day. Look up to them. It was really hard to leave. It was really hard to leave. And I was worried, right? Because you're always worried. Again, like well, maybe Little Rock was an anomaly. Maybe Chattanooga's an anomaly. Maybe Little Rock's an anomaly. So we moved here to Memphis. And we found that group again. And guess what we're doing on Tuesday nights now? Because of the pandemic. Started a Zoom Bible study. So wow. It's a virtual Bible study that we're having on Tuesday nights, and I think it's going great.
So, I'm not trying to oversimplify or I'm listening to you. There's a common denominator here, Walter, and I don't know if you've picked up on it or not, but don't get the big head here, but you seem to be the common denominator. You had something that you fell in love with at the Christian Student Center, some foundational things that I think you were really eager to not give up, not lose that. And it just so happened that, through being intentional and being purposeful and being driven, I don't think it's an accident that you just happen to fall into these, the same type of thing every place you went. I think that, you saw a need and you made sure that it was there. And I think that if that had not been there in those places, you probably would have been, like you said, a catalyst to start it. The takeaway here, and stop me or correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, because I don't want to do that. But one of the takeaways here is there's not a specific church. The church building is not the church. The church is you and the group of like-minded Christians. Wherever you're at, you have that. And I think a lot of people, maybe why the we don't see the kind of growth today that we saw in Acts 2, where the church was being added to daily, maybe because so many Christians today view the church as something they do on Sunday and not something they are every day. And so that passion may not be there like it needs to be there. And
yeah, I think
so. That's why I'm seeing that in you. You're taking that with you wherever you go. Fair assessment.
I think that's I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think like the relationships I've made with Christians, the best relationships I've made, it goes for Chattanooga, it goes for Little Rock, it goes for Memphis. The best relationships I've made have been outside the church building. And again, I'm not diminishing the church building. I'm not diminishing church services. I think that they serve a good purpose and that we should do it. But I think that relationships are built usually outside of that. Yeah. my best friend Caleb, I forged that friendship, because we got into a small group together after, Thursday night guys group, and we were awkward for a while, but then we built a relationship. And I think in Little Rock, the key was, just being real with people and having one-on-one conversations and building trust and building that relationship. And when you start doing that, these groups just kind of happen. Like, I think that's kind of the key point of Christianity. Like, you don't become a Christian to set up little worship services. You become a group of Christians that worship just breaks out. And I think of, like, anytime you get a group of Christians like around a campfire, like what normally happens there, right?
Yeah.
Someone starts singing and you break out in song. Like, worship just naturally breaks out. And I think that's the key. Like, you build the relationships first, and again, that takes intentionality, and all those other things will follow, because that's what we love to do. Like, we love God. We love to study. We love to talk about God. We love to worship. So, like, those things will naturally follow, but you have to be intentional about it.
Yeah. And this is one of the things you've said, relationships, and you've said, having this impact on people. One of the key, the cornerstones at the Christian Student Center is to do activities to bring people together so that those relationships can be built. And then once those relationships are built, you begin to have trust. You mentioned that, where you start to trust people. And once you have trust developed, that's when you can really have an impact on somebody, because that's when you can sit down once they trust you and you can say, hey, let me talk to you about Jesus Christ. Let me talk, where do you stand as far as your faith, as far as your belief in Christ and all of that? You can't do that unless you have been intentional about building those relationships. And you're reiterating something that I'm hearing over and over and over again from the students that come out of the Christian Student Center. And let me tell the adults that are listening, you've heard Walter just say it, that's transplantable. That is not something that is just stuck in a place like the CSC, and we can go, oh yeah, because the CSC has, they are on campus and they live together and it's easy for them to have that. Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit easier, but it's not impossible to transplant that to today's 21st century church and model the Acts 2 thing that was taking place. Okay, so let me ask you this question, Walter. Speaking of the Acts 2 church, do you think that there is, I don't want to use the word hope, but I'm going to use the word hope. Do you think that we should have hope that going into the future, your generation, as you transfer into a kind of a more and more of a leadership role, as you and Jesse, you start your family and that kind of thing, I feel very sure that you'll become more of a leader, if you're not already, in the church. The church at large, Christianity across the board, we have this idea of organized religions, and it just seems to be missing that element that you and I have talked about, that Acts 2 kind of element. Should we be hopeful that we can look forward to a widespread movement of what you yourself have been able to enjoy as you've moved from different place for your career? Does that, I've jumbled it all up. I know that I've gone all over the place to try to explain something.
Yeah, I
don't think I did.
I think it's a good question. And I think that, I think the answer is yes. I think that our society is dying for that community. If this might be a little bit of an outdated example, but I'm going to get it anyway. So remember a few years ago when Pokemon Go hit the scene and everybody was just crazy about it. I know some people still are. Shout out to all those people. I'm not one of those people, but I think that phenomenon, that cultural phenomenon, shows that our generation is dying for some sort of community. And if you look at like the internet culture and get into it, you can see like places like Reddit or TikTok. Not that I'm a TikToker, or any of the internet subcultures. You see that like that's what people want. They want these relationships, and I think that America has largely failed them in this relationship. And I think that where the church can really succeed now is building those communities, because I don't think it's something that people don't want anymore. I think it's something that people want more than ever, is true, genuine relationship. So I am hopeful, and I think that what I've seen in my generation, if we can generalize, is that renewed hope in that relationship and in those communities, and being together. So I hope so. I'm hopeful. I think that if it's the will of the Spirit, there's always hope for it, right?
Yeah, and that reminds me, I read a book a few years ago called Sticky Faith, and I'm basically dealing with, we're addressing high school and college students that leave the church and the statistics being really bleak. I'm reading a book right now by the same authors. It's called Growing Young, and it deals with the fact that unless churches have young people in them, and young people is defined in this book age 18 to 29, the outlet for that church survival is bleak. It's not a good outlook at all. Specifically, the book centered on that age demographic being vital to a church extending past into the next 100 years or so. So that in mind, I want to ask you, what is it that keeps you, because you again comprise that age demographic, what is it that keeps you going to church, and what would cause you to stop going to church?
So before I answer that question, I just want to make a comment on the statistics. I think it ties into what we've been talking about. Like, we often hear about how Christianity is declining, or the rise of the nuns, or this growing secularization of America. And whereas that might be true in America, that's not true worldwide. And religiosity, if that's a word, is growing worldwide. And there's good statistics out there that say by 2030, secularism will actually be on the decline. Maybe not in the West, but definitely in the East. And I think that a lot of the rise of the nuns, or the secularization of America, has been mostly people who used to claim to be Christians, but were nominal Christians at best. Because if you look at different demographics, like in the very evangelical conservative churches, they're retaining a lot of their people. And I've been reading I read a book by Tim Keller called Making Sense of God. It's a great book. It's written to the skeptical. But Tim Keller, he went to New York and founded a church. He's like, and everybody's like, you can't go to the middle of Manhattan and found a church. No one cares. No one wants Christianity there. And now his church is over 5,000 people, and we would have some, theological differences, but it's to say that, like, there's nothing to say that you can't do it and that people don't want it anymore. But what keeps me going is honestly, this is my life. This is who I am it's not just, Christianity is not just something you do. It's something that you're bought into and you're sold out to. And like my closest friends are the people I go to. And I don't think I could say that growing up, honestly. In like where I was when I was younger, like I had a really good friend group, and they were great people, but they weren't the people I went to church with. But when I moved to Little Rock, when I was at CSC, obviously I was around the CSC all the time. But when I moved to Little Rock, that was my core group, and like you couldn't separate me from that. And in Memphis, that's who I hang out with, and there's something to be said that like you need to hang out with other people too, and like to be lights and spread the gospel. But like that's what keeps my family here. And I love I mean, me, I can talk theology all day and all night. It's what fills me and satisfies me, right? So if you ask me like what will make me stop going, I really don't know. I mean, unless they kick me out because of something I've said, which is not all that unlikely, but I don't know, it's just who I am. So I just don't, I don't know. I'm not saying nothing could stop me, but it would be hard.
So obviously you've continued your educational career. You've the rigors of getting a Ph.D. in virology. Is that your focus was that? So, the rigors of that, defending a thesis, and now you're doing the postdoctoral work at St. Jude, which is, one of my favorite places. Shout out to St. Jude's, it's the incredible work that they do there. But through all of that, a lot of people that I know that are kind of follow the same career track, they actually lose their faith. They turn out to be atheists. And, it seems like the higher educated you get, the more resistant to God, creation, religion, that, and so that didn't happen to you. Your intersection of science and faith, as we've discussed before, not on this podcast, but in other times, that didn't happen. And I'm interested to get your viewpoint on why, what if anything, it strengthened your faith.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that, right? So there's not just one monolithic reason. Like one of the reasons is I always seem to find schools that were not antagonistic towards religion, or like I have friends who went to schools in further southern countries than southern states, not countries, unless you're talking about Texas. I have friends in other schools that have experienced like hostile people that are very against Christianity. And that wasn't my experience. Like, obviously I was around a lot of atheists and a lot of people that probably thought Christianity was stupid, but I was around a lot of people that were Christians. And I honestly, every year on Thanksgiving, the dean of my graduate school said a prayer before our Thanksgiving, potluck thing that we did. So I think that has something to do with it. But what really kept me in it was I had to change. I had to modify my views about a lot of things, and I had to be honest. And I think that really that started at the CSC. And I think that if I had not done that at CSC, my faith might have been wrecked, because I was given a very, very structured framework of how the world works and what the truth is and what can and cannot be the truth, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And that framework is so fragile. And I think we talked about this a couple years ago at the winter retreat. And when you construct a rigid framework on a foundation that's not Jesus, but it's on like my interpretation of this passage of the Bible has to be right, or the whole Bible is wrong, someone's going to throw a rock at that framework and it's going to come tumbling down. And I think that that's one of the biggest issues. Like when you say a lot of people go off and once they get more educated, they lose their faith, I think the reason is because they've been taught a false dichotomy, and they say you either have to have faith or you believe in all this other stuff. And our world is not that simple. Like everything's so much more complex. And your framework has to be built on Jesus and not on all these secondary issues. And I think that that's what really did it for me. I love the conversation between science and faith. I love that dialogue. That's one of my biggest. I read all kinds of books about it. I have a position on that. I'm not going to state it here because it's not. We'll just leave it at that. But I love that dialogue because I think it's important. Because what you said, a lot of people go into this area and they lose their faith. But I don't think it's at all necessary. And like, you don't even have to hold the interpretations that I do of the Bible to keep your faith. You just have to be okay with questioning and be okay with, figuring out maybe a different framework than what you've always believed. And like the Christian faith has survived all challenges. It's been around for thousands of years. And it is a robust faith. Every challenge has been thrown at the Christian faith and it has not died. So we should not be afraid to ask questions. And sometimes I think we teach our children that they can't ask certain questions because it might lead them down a path that they shouldn't go. Yeah. But like, that's how you build a rigid framework, not a rigid, a flexible framework that can stand the test of time, and robust. That's the word I like to use. I call it a robust faith. So like I said, I've changed a lot of my views, but the more that I think and learn and read stuff from all sides, the more I'm convinced that one, Christianity is a very rational worldview. Don't let anybody tell you it's not rational. You might disagree with me about if it's right or not, but it's not irrational. And the more I'm convinced that atheism or moralistic atheism is actually a contradiction of terms, right? You can be an atheist and say there are no morals, but as soon as you start arguing for morality, you have to base that on something,
Right.
And that's a bigger discussion for another day. But
yeah, excellent point, Walter. And I think it keeps coming up, in these different interviews that I'm doing with the Christian Student Center, and some people disagree with me on this, and that's okay, I guess. But what I've seen, as I've stepped back and looked at this, and an 18-year-old coming in, fresh out of high school, a lot of them have this very fragile framework that, if you shake it, if you poke a hole at it, it just crumbles apart. And a lot of that is because they've been raised in a very insulated environment. And let's be honest, you get out there in the world, you're going to have people that are going to start throwing rocks at it, poking at it. And this, the odds are, if they are not prepared to deal with these tough, hard issues, they're going to crumble. They're going to fall apart. And that's true of any background, home life, church life, denominational background. It makes no difference if they've been raised in that type of atmosphere where, I'm going to use your word here, it's not robust. And so what I saw there at the Student Center was an opportunity to create an environment where they could be exposed safely, without ridicule, to these questions. And we have dialogue and we have discussion, and we ground that in Scripture, where we're not afraid of really asking those tough questions. And you yourself coming through there were pretty dogmatic when you started. And, I looking at it long term, and now you're there, you begin to see some of the things that I said and why I said them back when you were, much younger man. I think it's crucial. And I think that we're doing students through those, college years, a big disservice if we don't, and even going into high school, churches shouldn't be afraid of, having those questions, those tough questions posed to them, and go ahead and start building that type of environment where they're going to be better prepared to deal with the rocks and the stones that are going to be thrown at them when they get to college and then post-college. So having you state that just reaffirms, it just makes me feel good.
That it's your fault, right?
How's that?
So when I got in, you're right. When I got into the Christian Student Center, I had very rigid views and very dogmatic about certain things. And it was that you loaned me a book called The Language of God, that it didn't change my view on anything, but it really started challenging, and it started that path down to where I am today. And ironically, I think where I am today, you would disagree with, but that book was the start of it. I'm pretty sure it was a vital turning point in my science and religion faith, at least. So
yeah, and I've always maintained the position that science and faith are very compatible. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians look at science and go, well, we can't go in the same room there. And a lot of the scientifically minded people look at the religious group and says, well, we can't go in the room with those people. And the fact of the matter is, God made both. He created science, and why the two cannot be compatible is beyond me. And, there again, we do get into some tricky questions and stuff, but, at the end of the day, the things that you and I might disagree on, these are not matters of salvation per se. Some of it, comes down to interpretation, but the fact that you can go through the rigors of what you've gone through as far as your education and others like you, and not only keep their faith, but grow it, strengthen it. I think at the end of the day, that's what, we can't ask for a better outcome than that. Walter, I'm going to give you the final, if you've got something that you want to say, or a shout out or whatever, I want to give you that opportunity now before we close this out.
Yeah, so if I could do a shameless plug, I will do a shameless plug.
Yes, go ahead.
So you mentioned my blog site at the beginning, but I've recently created a personal page, just walterharrington.com, because I've started a science blog too. So I created a central page where you can get to my theology blog or my science blog, and it's just my name.com, so it's easier to remember. And my final word is for everyone is I would encourage anyone listening to ask those hard questions and to really think for yourself, and especially for college students, because this was a big turning point in my life. I had to make my faith my own in college. Like, I came into college with all the answers, and I left college with many less answers, but a much firmer faith, if that makes sense. Because I knew why I believed at that point. When I came into college, I knew that I believed, but I didn't really know why. So that would be my encouragement. Don't be afraid of knowledge, and don't be afraid of the opposite side. Read what the other side says. You'll never truly be able to understand your own position and defend it against somebody else's if you don't know the other side. And not saying, and don't read them just to defend your side, although it's very hard not to sometimes. But sometimes people make good points, and we can learn from many different aspects. Paul quotes, when he's talking on Mars Hill, he quotes from the Greeks' own poets. So it's obvious that Paul was in the literature of the day, and Paul knew the other sides and knew what everybody was saying. And I think that's an asset. It's not something to be feared. So that's what I would challenge people, just to think and ask yourself, why do I believe in God? Why do I believe in Jesus? And do I have a reason? And if not, I'd encourage you to search it out.
Great points, Walter. Again, walterharrington.com. And for those of you that are listening and tuning in, I've read a lot of what Walter has written. Great stuff. I would encourage you to go to it and read it. He brings a remarkable ability to communicate and bring together science and religion in ways that are easy to understand. So I would encourage you guys, if you want to really start digging deep. He didn't mention this. Walter is a serious student of the Bible, and so he's not afraid to deal with some of these tough issues. And I have personally gotten a lot out of some of the things that you've written. So continue that. I look forward to other stuff that you write. Walter, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule, spending time with us today. I've really enjoyed catching up with you and seeing you. We're doing like the Zoom thing.
Yeah.
So I wish I would have invested in Zoom before all this started. That would have been a good idea. We're going to keep you in our prayers and our thoughts. For those listening, keep Walter in your thoughts and prayers as he continues his postdoctoral work at St. Jude. Final words, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Tune in next Thursday for another podcast of Lion, the Way, and the War. Until then, be kind to one another. Pray for our nation and our leaders, and everybody have a blessed week.